Good afternoon, all. Thank you. Thank you for joining me today to explore the new developments in the aerospace and defense sector, primarily onto the maintenance, repair, and overhaul, for the aerospace and defense sector or related to the aftermarket services in the industrial manufacturing for the commercial, regional, general aviation, and the military aircraft. And while the industry dynamics for the MRO are slightly different from the aftermarket services in manufacturing, the overall trends, challenges, and some of the digital opportunity remains same in both the companies. So myself, Srini Burra, I lead the aerospace and defense vertical for Tech Mahindra, and today we'll explore some of the key agenda items. So we'll discuss about the trends, the challenges, and more importantly, MRO.next is the new platform Tech Mahindra is thinking through on developing it along with the AWS. And this platform is going to give the digital transformation roadmap and as well as some of the solutions what the aerospace and defense industry could consider in developing. So before I get started, I just would like to give a quick overview about Tech Mahindra. It's an Indian multinational IT services and consulting company with 145,000 professionals with 90 plus countries and over 1,250 customers globally. And we are part of the Mahindra Group, one of the largest and most admired multinational conglomerate of companies. So more importantly, I think what's driving the investment in MRO services, before we get into the trend. If you see the graph onto the right, that shows us there is a huge demand in attempting to ramp up the aircraft because the production to meet the supply chain and the quality needs. So we see almost the new aircraft order backlog is right now at 16,000 for the narrow and wide body, and it takes many years for them to fulfill. And at the same time, we are also seeing there is a stopgap measure which is driving the increase for the demand, and the retirement of those engines or the aircrafts is still slow. So I think there is, on the one side, we see the demand, and the other side, we are not seeing the retirement of the aircrafts which are as planned because the demand is not getting fulfilled. And we are seeing the changing in the aircraft fleet mix as well, because now we are seeing almost the narrow body fleet flying from the New York to Singapore, and these overhaul, these long flights are giving the shorter maintenance for the landing gear because they are not used as frequently as it used to be before, but also at the same time the cycle time for the engine is going to increase. So I think one of the challenge is how would the airlines and the OEMs try to find ways to reduce the maintenance cost. One is we are seeing the maintenance cost for the engine, other we are seeing the maintenance cost to be pressured, and the more important thing is what kind of repairs needs to be standardized is one of the key aspect, and we are seeing that the emergence of the new advanced technologies are happening. Military aircrafts likely to drive some of the demand and the MRO services. So this is one of the key driving factors for the MRO services in the industry. We are making an observation. And when it comes to the challenges, I think it is very evident that in the MRO sector, either it's in airlines or the OEMs, most of the jobs are the deskless. That means we are seeing the technicians are working at the hangar, at the aircraft, at the engine, and they need to have a kind of a standard instructions. They are looking for new technologies, and since these are the aging workforce is another big concern which we are making an observation. So there are many trends today in the North America. By 2027, it is predicted that there would be a 27% of the skill labor shortage, and there are some areas the industries are looking to engage the digital transformation. And on the third important thing is, while we have a standard procedures, we have the aging workforce, it necessitates the companies to consider investments into the digital transformation. And that's where we are seeing the third trend. And if you're trying to look at some of the areas, like Boeing predicts that the global needs for their new maintenance technicians are more than 610,000 employees by 2040. So I think we are seeing that there is a huge demand for some of the workforce, and as well as it necessitates the importance of the investment into the technology. At the same time, I think today Tech Mahindra is working with Frost & Sullivan. We are trying to understand the dynamics of the industry. We are interviewing from the OEMs, from the airlines, from the defense. And what we have made an observation, the paper would get launched in Jan of 2025, but current insight says that today, even most of the companies in the aerospace and defense, we have close to 51% gap or 49% gap when it comes to still adopting the technology. 50% of the companies have still tried to start either the implementation of the digital to consider on how they could train their new age workforce, what kind of the actions they need to take in their shops when it comes to the investment of the technology, what kind of the AI and AR, VR technologies investments they have to do it. And some of the trends we are saying is market scenario is demanding for an investment in the digital transformation. Now, when we try to look into the second aspect of the technology impact gives a different view. One is, how do we ensure that the production management, the quality, digital workforce, sustainability initiatives are getting powered by the new age technologies. And that's where one of the key important aspect of the industrialization of the platform is coming in picture, where we are trying to call that as an MRO.next. And this platform is trying to enable the shop floor and the hangar workforce, and as well as the OEMs, to start rethinking on utilizing some of the technology aspects they could start taking an advantage of. We are also trying to provide a training using the AR, and we see a lot more adoption of the mixed reality right now, where they could see the instructions and perform the repair parallelly for the new age workforce, and as well as try to have the replica of the engines and the aircrafts while the repair and the trainings are happening. Please, we encourage you to stop by at our booth. We have some of the demos on our Apple Vision Pro, and you could experience the technology impact which is creating the demand. The other important aspect the digital transformation is trying to solve. When we have started interviewing most of the overhaul shops as well as the airlines, we have seen that work scope variation is one common denominator across everyone. Until unless you open the engine, you will not be able to figure it out what kind of a repairs needs to be performed. While we are trying to understand the repair types before the engines gets into the shop, but the moment the engine is getting opened, we see that there is a variation in the work scope. And the second thing is, because of this variation, unavailability of the material is causing a serious concern, because this is increasing the turnaround time, and finding from the shops cannot be addressed because in the contract they have some details in the contract, and the repair cannot be performed until unless the contract gets updated. So I think these delays are significantly causing delay for the overall turnaround time. And in the services organization, if we are not able to meet up or reduce the turnaround time, the profitabilities are getting quite shrinked. And this is a major concern. We have made an observation in our conversation. Of course, upskilling and improving the safety standard is a very important aspect. While we have visited some of the shops globally, it was very important for the shop operators and the plant leaders to request us how we could ensure that the safety could be paramount. And I think we are also developing some solutions for safety. We call it a Vision AI, and we have developed some very interesting ML models which would be easy for them to adopt, and these ML models would be available on our MRO.next platform beginning of the next year. And of course, reducing the defects and rework is another key factor which gives us the survey results in our conversations with different MRO operators. So what is this MRO.next business platform looks like? And I think we are trying to create a very modular architecture. This is embarking on the tech transformation journey, and we are trying to identify what would be those key modules the OEMs and the aircraft operators can take an advantage of, either it in the supply chain management, how they could plan their advanced inventory ahead of a time if they have to really perform. What kind of the tools, what kind of a data integration, what kind of the availability they need to have if they are trying to procure the used service materials from the other service shops and other OEMs. And I think we are trying to develop some solutions out there. Equipment reliability, I think we have developed some of this within our own Mahindra ecosystem in our Chakan plants. We are trying to take some best practices from there. We have developed some algorithms based on the condition-based maintenance, asset management systems, and the digital workforce. So this is a very interesting use case. I think we have already developed, implemented in some of the key shops where the new recruited young talent is trying to get trained, and I think we highly encourage you to please experience that. Sustainability, today Tech Mahindra won multiple awards when it comes to the sustainability initiative. I think we are trying to develop these platforms and we are trying to build that into our MRO.next. Of course, customized dashboards and reports, which necessitates for the plant managers, because once we see the persona of a plant manager and we try to understand what would plant manager would take an advantage of. I think we are trying to even integrate the non-destructive testing, mobility access. They need to have a module of financial management. Can they also report their CO2 emissions to the governments of the respective countries? And some of these modules are getting integrated into our new MRO.next platform. And this would be scaled and available onto the AWS very soon. And we are working with some of our key customers and hoping some of the audiences and some of the customers can take an advantage of this. So finally, MRO providers today are heavily focused on their servicing the aging fleets, which is very evident. The reason is they still have to keep up with their aging fleet, because the new fleet still, because of the supply chain challenges, are not getting delivered on time, and which accounts for most of the demand for their services. That's the key observation we are having. And that's when we are trying to make sure that how we could keep the safety, quality, and ensure the delivery, while keeping the cost low, is becoming paramount for most of the companies. And we are working on those solutions. And given the MRO.next business platform, powered by AWS, or preparing for the long-term success for the customers we are trying to serve. I think these are the details I was planning to share today. Just if you have any questions, happy to take the questions. Thank you. Thank you for joining. Appreciate it.